There we are. All right. I'm going to talk about perspective taking and dishonest communication. The reason that perspective taking is in there and that I need to say quite a few things about it is that the whole debate about deception in communication has boiled down to that particular issue. Because, of course, the examples of camouflage that, for example, Philippe showed, they don't have the intentionality part. They don't have the imagination part. And so there are a lot of cases of deception. Nature is full of communication, and as a result, nature is full of deception. There's a lot of examples of deception that don't have that intentionality part. So I'm going to say quite a bit about how that fits. So you have all these cases of evolved camouflage or evolved mimicry that is deceptive. It has a deceptive function, but it's not clear that it has a deceptive intention in the sense that these organisms are evolved this particular way because it gave them advantages. And of course, that's the story of deception all around, is that you only deceive if you get advantages from it. So it is linked to the benefits that it provides. There are very remarkable cases in nature, and there are cases that are much more complex than what these butterflies and so on are doing. This is the mimic octopus, and there is definitely some cognition involved here. I'm not sure there's an intention involved, but I'll show you what this is.
Unknown until it was spotted, first by fishermen off the coast of Indonesia in the 1990s. It looked like an octopus, but it could morph its shape in an instant to appear as seemingly any animal around it. At first, no one had any idea what it was.
The first time I saw it, I just was blown away. You couldn't get a more spectacular animal. It really is the pinnacle of wizardry.
Biologist Mark Norman was the first scientist to study this seemingly shapeless creature. He named it the mimic octopus.
The mimic octopus makes itself look like a living, moving animal. So it pulls all its arms around behind its body and swims along like a poisonous flatfish called a banded sole. In other cases, if it's getting attacked, it puts 6 arms down a hole and raises the other 2 arms to look like a poisonous sea snake that has bands along its body. If that's not enough, it'll swim along looking like a poisonous lionfish with these banded arms looking like the banded spines that come off these very deadly fish.
So far, 15 separate species are known to be in the mimic octopus act, and Norman is not always sure exactly what the mimic is doing. He observed this mimic scuttling along the sea bottom, looking something like a furry turkey with human legs.
Sometimes it's hard when you watch a mimic octopus doing what it does to interpret what's going on. It's a bit like looking at ink spots in a psychiatrist's office going, I don't know what that is. It could be a piano, it could be a fridge. So you get 3 or 4 divers together and you'll argue all night trying to work out what we think it was mimicking.
Where did nature's greatest actor come from?
So this is obviously much more complex, and we don't understand fully. We know that these invertebrates have enormous brains, 6 million cells in their brain. I mean, this is much bigger than any other invertebrate. So do they need to see the examples to mimic them? It's very hard to imagine that they are born with these patterns completely built in. That's hard to imagine, so there's some learning process involved. So this is definitely much more complex than you'd think in terms of mimicry. And there's now recently a report of cuttlefish, and I'll first show you what a cuttlefish can do with its body.
Its skin contains millions of pigment cells with which it can create ever-changing colors and patterns. And that, apparently, hypnotizes the crab.
So the cuttlefish has all these color patterns, and now recently a report came out in Biology Letters on cuttlefish males who mimic on one side a male. So they're courting, this male on the right is courting a female on the left. he has his male pattern on the side of the female so that she knows she's dealing with a male who wants her. He has a female side on the other side because there's a rival male over there who is now thinking he's looking at two females instead of a male and a female, who would be in competition for him. So this was recently reported. This is very complex stuff, and you can think that maybe this is all instinctive, and as people call these things, but the word instinctive is not used very much for animals anymore, for the reason that most of these patterns have some sort of learning component in them. And we don't fully understand how this works, but this is complex deception. But again, we don't know how intentional this is. We do assume that there's a learning process involved. Now then you have this kind of papers on crying wolf. And there's certainly not just monkeys who do this, there's birds who do this all the time. So giving false alarm calls, situations where there's food around and you want everyone to go. And so this has been reported for many species. I think it's a very simple learning process, but still it complicates, of course, communication in the sense that who are you gonna trust? So it undermines the reliability and the honesty of communication. And so it cannot be done too often. If I give always false alarm calls, no one is going to listen to me anymore. So it is a complex issue in terms of the consequences for the communication system. And there's a long debate in the communication literature of animals of how honest communication actually is. Is communication a manipulation of others, or is it an honest transfer of information? Since clearly we are interested in politics to some degree when we talk about deception, I want to give a few cases of political deception, but I'll keep the current administration out of it, so you don't need to worry about that part. So in dominance displays of the primates, there's not just the primates actually, all animals, there's an enormous amount of deception going on. And the big trick is, of course, to make yourself look bigger than you are. And this is a chimpanzee male. These two males are the same size, but the male on the left is the dominant male. And he's walking on two legs. He puts all his hair up. He looks big. And actually all the political debates that you see are along the same lines. Looking big is a good thing if you are a political candidate. So I'll show you a little video of this. This is a female chimp who greets a male, the alpha male, and you will see how the alpha male walks. So the greeting that she does is pant grunting, which is a signal of submission. She's pant grunting. So you see the male puts up all his hair. I'm standing much too close. This is very dangerous, actually, because a male chimp is a very strong animal. So that's a sort of display, and we call that the bipedal swagger. And the bipedal swagger is very much a dominance display. It's very common in humans. I have an enormous collection of bipedal swaggers, and so that whole posture is a chimpanzee display, basically. And during the last year's primaries, I think there was constantly on exhibit this kind of intimidation, and it went even to the point that people were starting to make anatomical comparisons, like my hands are this size and the rest is also this size. And that's the level of discussion we've reached in human politics, which is really, I think, the chimpanzee level that we are now. So just as a last example, this is George Bush who walks with Vicente Fox, the president of Mexico, and you see he's much smaller. This is the official photo that came out of this occasion, which means that he's standing on something. So, and politicians do that all the time. In short, politicians like, let's say, Sarkozy in France or Berlusconi in Italy, they travel with boxes. They have a little box with them on which they can stand. And actually Sarkozy, the latest case on Sarkozy was that he traveled to Belgium to a factory and he bussed in people shorter than himself. 30 people shorter than himself, and then he stood among them and the photo was taken. So that's how sensitive the politicians are for size and how important the deception in that area is. Now, perspective taking as I said, that's the big debate that we have in the literature on animal deception. And that's basically a question of how smart is the deception, how much of the intentionality and the imagination that Philippe mentioned is actually in there. And we've been going around and around on that, but to make it very simple for you, if you approach a monkey, I've had for 25 years capuchin monkeys, and for macaques it's the same thing. If you approach a monkey in a cage, you can see from all the signals of what kind of mood the monkey is. Is he aggressive? Is he fearful? Is he friendly? Lip smacking and things like that. So you get an honest communication usually from the monkey. If you approach an ape, let's say an orangutan or a chimpanzee, you don't get honest communication necessarily. The chimpanzee may be extremely friendly, maybe picking something out of its cage and offer it to you with the friendliest face. And we always have to warn our students that you cannot trust that, because actually the chimp is most of the time is waiting to grab the person. So it brings them close, lures them in, and then gets them. So it's a very dangerous situation with orangutans and chimpanzees, because they don't honestly communicate what they want. And that's a big difference. That never happens with the monkeys, but that happens all the time actually with the apes. And so that's a big difference, and I think it relates to the fact that apes have this perspective-taking capacity, just like we do. We are basically apes. I know you know the difference between apes and monkeys, I hope. We are basically apes. We are large, tailless primates, and so we have the same sort of capacities. So anecdotal evidence for deception actually started with my book Chimpanzee Politics. In Chimpanzee Politics I had a whole list interspersed in the account of deceptive cases in chimpanzees. And then Whiten and Byrne, a couple of years later, they made an even bigger list. They invited people to tell their stories about deception in primates. Most of the cases were chimpanzees. And so we have a whole collection of anecdotes. And I'm not sure if I have the time to go into the anecdotes, but typical example, for example, is you have a young male chimpanzee who is courting a female. He does this with an erect penis sitting right in front of her, and a high-ranking male comes around the corner and sees him. He immediately drops his hands over his penis, so hiding the penis from view. That's a typical case of deception, which requires that young male understands that the telltale signal of what he's doing is the penis, not something else. So he needs to be aware of his own communications and how others outside may interpret that communication. It's a very complex thing to do these things, and that's why we have many stories on chimps doing this. We have actually very few stories of monkeys doing this. This is probably the best known case of monkeys, which came out of Hans Kummer's work, who described that a female baboon was grooming a lover, basically. She was grooming a male that she liked a lot. But she could not do that in view of the dominant male, and so the young male was hiding behind a rock and she was grooming, and what the alpha male saw was a female sitting behind a rock. That's all he saw. And so Kummer was sort of speculating about what this meant. And did this mean that the female understood that the male did not know, and so on. So that whole story. Also, you see in the drawing, the young male has a fierce look as if he's part of the deception, which is not clear at all that that's the case, but that's the story. And so that's how the debate got started a little bit about, like, what do they really know about these deceptions? And in this particular case with the baboons, people were pessimistic that these baboons had a full understanding of what was going on. Very soon after all this, people turned to joint attention as the main measure of intentionality. Not joint attention as a deceptive tactic. It's not a deceptive thing, but people started to emphasize joint attention as an indicator of, let's say, theory of mind. And I'll get to theory of mind itself later. A big deal was made about it, and I think it was initially because Philippe knows this history. I think initially it was thought that joint attention was a uniquely human thing. Even though I think basically all animals, social animals, have joint attention. But people were making a very big deal out of it and focusing on joint attention and doing experiments on it. So here you have a typical experiment which is done on chimpanzees, where someone stares at something and then sees that the chimpanzee follows the attention, and then the question is it because they want to see what others see, which I think is most of the time the case, or have they learned that there must be something of interest? So do they understand that others see something, gives them knowledge? So do they understand the knowledge states of others? So it was a very complex question that was focused on joint intentionality. But now we have studies, as I said, I think it occurs in many animals. We now have studies on dogs and joint intentionality and so on, and joint attention. And basically the topic is now gone because we have clearly seen that it's not limited to humans at all. So following the attentions of others. I can give you one funny anecdote that I have myself, is that I once worked at a zoo where a whole group of chimpanzees was just sitting around or laying around until a hawk flew over with a chicken in his feet. So basically a very unusual hawk with a chicken underneath of it flew over. He had stolen that somewhere at a farm. And one chimp looked up, and there was no sound. They did not give sounds. One chimp looked up, and within a second, like 25 chimps were looking at the hawk. And so joint intention is very common for animals to pay attention to where others pay attention to. The first one to do experiments on this perspective-taking ability was Emil Menzel, who worked for the longest time here in Atlanta, actually, and his son still works here. And Emil started doing these guess or no games with chimpanzees, even though he didn't call it guesses and knowers, and he didn't speak of theory of mind, but he's basically the pioneer of theory of mind. And what he did is he would hide some food in an enclosure and have 5 chimps and young chimps in a building, and one chimp he would show where the food was, or the snake. He would also hide toy snakes. He would bring them back and then release all 5 of them and then see what they would do. And his question was, if one chimpanzee knows something, will the others know what he knows? And so will they be eager to go out if there's food, or will they be reluctant to go out when there's a snake? And what will they do? And he plotted all sorts of deceptions that were going on, because he described how the dominant male would try to follow a female who knew something, and the female would lead him first to a small amount of food so that he was happy there, and then she would rush off to the big amount of food because he would hide 2 kinds of food. So he plotted in his articles all these deceptions that were going on. And we recently reran the study, the Menzel study. So this is his chimps with a snake, and you see instead of just going up to it, they have picked up a stick to poke it. They're careful with it, and they're all very, very careful. And so they immediately read from the body language of the other chimp what has been hidden. Is it food or a snake, and so on. This is a replay for the BBC where we did our experiment. Katie Hall ran a lot of experiments like this, Menzel experiments. I'll first show this.
When an animal, like a chimpanzee, is aware that another in their group might have a different perspective on the world, it gives them an advantage. It allows the chimp to lie and to manipulate others. Primatologist Frans de Waal coined the phrase chimpanzee politics. He and his team have set up an ingenious experiment to reveal how a low-ranking animal can deceive a more dominant member of the group.
What we do here is we hide food. One individual knows where food is hidden, the other one doesn't know where the food is hidden, and then we see how they manipulate the relationship in order to get the food.
So how do you do that? You show an animal food and hide it in the enclosure, I take it?
We show a low-ranking female where food is hidden, then we release her together with a high-ranking female who doesn't know anything, and then the low-ranking one, she can wait till the other one is gone or distracted. She can also mislead the other one and lead her in a wrong direction, in order to get to the food in time.
We are testing Missy and Rita.
Rita, the dominant chimp, comes out first. If she knew where the banana was, she would simply help herself. But only Missy, the subordinate chimp, saw the banana being hidden under the red tube. Missy is also aware that Rita has no idea where that banana is. In other words, she realizes that Rita has a different perspective on the same situation. Missy notices Rita close to the food, so she tries to appear nonchalant. Rita now wanders off, and when she's far enough away, Missy goes for the banana. She has successfully deceived Rita.
Missy's found her banana.
Frans has observed this behaviour in chimps, but it's very rare in other animals.
That kind of deception is not so typical. I think probably dolphins are capable of it, and maybe elephants. But you need a large brain, I think. Yeah, so we did many of these tests, and of course, if you do them regularly, the dominant individual who doesn't know, you see there's two doors here. One door has a window, the other one doesn't. So the subordinate is behind the door with the window and can see where the caretaker hides the food, and the dominant sits behind a solid door. But if you do this often enough, the dominant knows that something has been hidden. And in this next clip, you see very clearly.
April 14th, 2010, Renette and Georgia. Here's Georgia. And Renette. Okay, Renette found the cucumber. Okay, Renette has found the banana.
Yeah?
Once the subordinate touches the banana and it's safe.
Yeah.
Is there a critical distance at which they would grab the banana? I mean, they could rush to the banana first and be safe, independently of that.
Yeah, they could, yeah. Yeah.
But they don't do that.
They don't necessarily do it, no. I've also seen chimps come out and check where the banana is, and so look if it's still there, and then they leave and they wait till the dominant is sitting somewhere, and then they wait for. Huh?
Dominant went to the subordinate holders. Did the dominant go into the subordinate holders there?
Yeah, they can go in and out.
Oh, okay.
But during the experiment, they sit, they're locked up there.
Can this affect the status? Can this affect the status? Can a dominant become subservient to the one?
Based on this?
Yes.
No, then there's much more. You need a lot more to be dominant.
Remember frustration from the dominant one for never getting them down?
Yeah, of course they're frustrated. Sometimes they even throw a tantrum. So yeah.
No invoked learned helplessness off 19?
No?
No invoked learned helplessness as a result over repetition?
Oh, learned helplessness. I don't know much about that.
Okay.
So the perspective taking, I think in children it comes up around the age that children start to recognize themselves in the mirror. And for that reason, people got very interested in the mirror test. I'm not sure that the mirror test still means what we think it means, but there have been speculations that perspective-taking capacities also as reflected in empathy and helping responses, which is a topic I'm really interested in, that perspective-taking comes up in evolution also in the same species who recognize themselves in mirrors. And I'll just want to briefly show what we do with the mirror test. This is what a chimp does with a mirror test. This is a chimp, Rowena, at Yerkes, who has a hole in her head caused by a nail, and she's using our iPhone as a mirror. So she's inspecting, she's very coordinated, doing this. So this is something that the apes do all the time. They use mirrors spontaneously. And your average dog is not doing this. And if you have a dog that does this, you call me, and I will probably be skeptical. So, and this is what a monkey does. This is a capuchin monkey, also with a mirror. And the monkey is also interested, but it's not self-referencing in the mirror. It's not using the mirror to inspect itself. People always say that monkeys see a stranger in the mirror. I'm not convinced of that at all. I don't think they see a stranger would have a very different reaction from this monkey. So I don't think they see a stranger, but they don't see themselves. It's an interesting sort of in-between stage that they have. Now, dolphins have been tested on this. So the large-brained mammals, like the apes, the dolphins, and the elephants, have mirror self-recognition. And we were the ones who tested the elephant the first. This is an Asian elephant in front of the mirror. This is in Thailand. And the elephant is marked on two sides of its head. One is a visual mark that you can see, and that he's inspecting now. And on the other side you put a share mark. So the elephant feels being marked on both sides, but it's not a visual mark. So now this is a different day where he's marked on a different side. And again he's inspecting this. So the elephant is interesting because not only does the elephant have a much bigger brain than humans, but the elephant has 3 times more neurons. And people didn't know that, so there was a time that people said he's now actually inspecting the inside of his mouth. He's using the mirror to look inside his mouth. There was a time, like 5 years ago, where people said we should not look at brain size at all, we should just look at the number of neurons, and that will tell us how intelligent an animal is. And at that time, humans had the most neurons, and so everyone was happy with that proposal. And then the elephant came along, and now people don't know what to do anymore, because they have 3 times more neurons than we do. So the elephant has that, and elephants can be extremely deceptive, and actually, elephants are the animals that kill the most zookeepers in the US. And I'm sure that has something to do with the deceptive tactics that they have. Just to give you one anecdote on that, is that many elephants in India and Thailand who have been equipped with bells and walk around with a bell so that everyone knows where they are and so that you're not surprised in your kitchen by an elephant. Many of the elephants, they stuff grass in the bells so that they don't ring. So that's very interesting because no one has shown them that, I'm sure. So how they have that, that's imagination right there, how they imagine that this will work. And I think elephants are extremely intelligent animals. So one measure that I am interested in with perspective taking, and that's sort of the opposite of deception, is what I call targeted helping. And targeted helping is when you provide help based on understanding the situation of somebody else. So it is help that has perspective taking built in, so to speak, so that you understand the predicament of somebody else. Which is sort of the opposite of deception, because in deception, you use the situation of somebody else and what you understand of it by deceiving the other. And so that's why that debate about perspective taking is so important in the deception literature, is because the optimal form of deception takes the situation of the other into account. And targeted helping is a topic I'm very interested in.
And she's now giving it to Malaika.
Simple here. This is not a natural situation. This is in the bonobo sanctuary, and this bonobo female is always feeding juveniles with water. She doesn't need to do that. There's a whole river right next to her, so it's more like a game. But this is the sort of thing that apes do. They understand where that water can be desirable, they understand where it goes. It doesn't go into the ears or behind, it goes into the mouth. So they have some understanding of the other and the situation of the other. And apes do that kind of thing. It's quite common in them. Food transfers and so on. We now have finally an experiment on targeted helping. So we used to have an enormous amount of stories of how spontaneously this comes about. But Yamamoto in Japan did an experiment recently where he had 2 chimpanzees, and one chimpanzee had a choice between 7 tools. And the other chimpanzee in the back needs only 1 tool. The one in the back needs a particular tool, and so the one in the front needs to look at the situation of the other, judge the situation, such as do you need a rake or a saw or a rope or whatever you need, judge that situation and then pick out the tool, and they're willing to do that even though they get nothing for it. So it's also, in addition, an altruism test. So it needs to pick out the right tool for the other, which means that they need to take the perspective of the other to understand what the other needs. And so there's now finally experiments on this. I want to show you a clip on elephants of targeted helping. So this is actually very complex, but what this requires is that the adult understands what the situation is, that it's slippery, it's a ditch, sees all the attempts, there's probably vocalizations involved in it also, even though you can hear that. And then understands what the action is that will bring about a change and an improvement. So this is actually very complex, and this is a perspective-taking ability, which I think some animals have and a lot of animals don't have. And that's why deception, I think, is more developed in the species who have that kind of capacity. Now, theory of mind is, of course, the term that is always used in the literature to describe this kind of perspective-taking. I don't like the term at all, because I don't think theory is much involved in it. I think it's a bodily process to a large degree. But, okay, people have talked theory of mind, and they focus on knowledge. They focus on, do you understand the knowledge of somebody else, the intentions of somebody else, and so on. And as I mentioned already, Menzel was the first one to do experiments on this. There's many terms that have been used. This is a list that Andy Whiten put together of all the terms that have been used. And he prefers the term mind reading, which is also, I think, a very troublesome term, which I associate with a magician or something. Rather than something else, but that's the terminology that people have used. So the theory of mind debate actually started in apes. It didn't start in children, even though it became very big in children. But it started in the 70s with Emil Menzel's work, and his work on do chimps know what others know, basically. Then Nick Humphrey, he said animals are natural psychologists. Animals try to understand the psychological state of somebody else. So Humphrey did this kind of thing, and then we had, of course, Woodruff and Primack, who did their chimpanzee experiment and came up with the term theory of mind. And then very soon thereafter, people like Povinelli and Tomasello said there's no way that apes have theory of mind. They were very negative on it, and they had done a few experiments where the apes failed the test. Then Brian Hare, with Tomasello, here at Yerkes, did a test which seemed to indicate that they had it. And then, of course, after that, this is always how it goes. We now have experiments on theory of mind in birds, and we have them on capuchin monkeys. And actually, theory of mind is probably not unique, not even unique to the hominoids. So Povinelli did all these tests that provided negative evidence on this, and I'll show you a little clip of his work.
Understanding of who they are. Do they have any understanding of the minds of others?
This is the looking part.
This chimp tries to follow the researcher's gaze, but that's not so unusual. The question is, does he realize that the researcher may know something because he's looking at it? Does the chimp have any insight into what others might actually know? In this test, the chimp has been trained to point to one person who will give her a cookie. But when given a choice, does she realize that only the person who can see her will know what she's doing? The chimp does not catch on. Perhaps it's not enough to have just your eyes covered. In this experiment, a researcher hides another cookie. Kara has to pick one of two people to show her where it is. Will she realize the man with the bucket doesn't know where the cookie's hidden? Both people then point to a cup. Kara has to choose who is right. 3-year-old children cannot do this, but 4-year-olds can.
Well, we don't need to go over all this, but my view on negative evidence is it's worthless. It has some use in our science, but people have made far too big a deal about negative evidence. And so if you do a test where a chimpanzee doesn't respond with someone with a bucket over the head, and they make no distinction between someone with a bucket over the head and someone who doesn't have a bucket, you still don't know anything. Who knows why this happens? And there's so many results that are negative that normally we would never report, but in this field of chimpanzee research it is always reported because psychologists and anthropologists and all the social sciences are so eager to see differences between humans and animals that as soon as you can say, well, animals cannot do this, whereas humans have no trouble with it, everyone's extremely happy. And that's why we have this flood of negative findings that usually 5 years later is corrected because we do a better experiment, which is better suited to the species, for example. And this has been the pattern for the last 50 years. We have all these claims of uniqueness that have all fallen by the wayside. And the same thing happened with the theory of mind discussion, because there was a phase of about 10 years or 15 years where people said, well, theory of mind was maybe discovered in the chimpanzee, but they actually don't have it. And then Brian had this experiment, which is basically a variation on the mental experiment, and Brian would be the first one to admit that it is a variation, a sort of contained version of the mental experiment, where he would have two chimpanzees, the subordinate and the dominant, who could see into a cage, food being hidden, and the food that is being hidden is sometimes visible for the dominant, sometimes it's not visible for the dominant where it's being hidden, and then they release the subordinate just a second before the dominant, and they release them both into that space. And then the subordinate tends to go to the place where the food has been hidden that the dominant doesn't know about. So it takes the knowledge state of the dominant into account. And there's several variations that have been done on this. And so that was the first time, and this is a chimp-to-chimp test, which is why it is so much more powerful than what Povinelli did, which is a chimp-to-human test. Chimps, the view that chimps have of humans is very abnormal, because humans know everything and have all sorts of tools and possibilities. So for example, if I come to the field station and a chimp is sick and I walk up to the chimp and ask him to turn around so that he can look at his behind or something like that, the chimp may wonder how I know that he has something on his behind. How do I know that? Before I even have walked up to him, I seem to have knowledge. And so the view that chimps have of humans is very abnormal, and it's much better to test them against each other, as Brian did, than against humans, because humans are almighty in their view. So Brian did an experiment later. He followed up on this in Leipzig, a deception experiment. So he would sit at a place where the chimp could steal food from him, and would the chimp go to the place where he was not looking? That was basically his goal here. And that's what the chimp does. And then he would chase the chimp off. And so he started doing these kind of experiments to test their abilities to deceive and to be silent, or to wait for the right opportunity. So this is not exactly a perspective-taking experiment, but this is just, are they silent? They're very silent when they take the stuff away from behind him. I think that's very interesting. Then in the field, people did a perspective-taking experiment. So we have now, I'll get to this, we have a false belief task now that was done on chimpanzees, and I'll get to that. But this is a field experiment which was done recently, which was very interesting, because what they did is they put I think it's a toy snake, it's a fake snake that they put in the forest. And the chimpanzees would discover the snake, and then they would see, would they give alarm calls if there's another chimp, you see a chimp in the back there, if the other chimp knows about it or doesn't know about it. And so do they take the knowledge state of somebody else into account? You will see how this goes. This chimp will have a freak out reaction when he sees the snake, and then he, I'm not sure you will hear the alarm calls. We'll see how that goes. When you give the alarm call, you cannot hear that. I think there's two alarm calls. One is the stop food, as we call it. The other one is the wall bar, which is very loud. You give the alarm. And so then they measured how often do they give these alarm calls. And what they found is that if other individuals are nearby who have seen the snake, heard alarm calls before, or are ignorant, you see they do it far more for the ignorant ones than the ones who have seen the snake. And so this is the first field experiment that indicates that chimpanzees take the knowledge state of somebody else into account, which again is a perspective-taking ability, which I think is extremely important for any form of deception. Then people started doing perspective-taking on the corvids. This is a scrub jay. And so these are very famous experiments where the scrub jays, they cache food regularly, and then they would see if a second jay can see them hiding the food, what will they do? So what you have is you can hide food on your own, or you can hide food with an observer. The observer is also a competitor who can steal your food. And then they see what happens if you take the competitor away after that. And many of the jays, they re-hide the food if the competitor is gone. So the competitor has seen them, then when the competitor is gone, they start to re-hide the food. Which means that they are deceptive. And they are more deceptive if they themselves have been stealing food. So the research is basically what they say is it takes the food to know it's stealing. So these were the first studies of perspective taking in birds. And in this whole caching paradigm of birds, for example, recently there's very nice studies on ravens that have been done. Ravens have that same tendency. They become highly deceptive. They are very aware of others who see where they hide things. And they are very manipulative in the sense that they will re-hide things if that's necessary. Now, at some point in that whole debate about theory of mind, in this child literature, they started to stress that actually the best test of theory of mind is the false belief task. And this was something we could never play with the apes. And so the false belief task, I suppose all of you know how that works, is that you have an individual who knows where something is hidden, another individual re-hides that thing, and you as an observer, you know that it has been re-hidden, but the original actor doesn't know that it has been re-hidden. And so where do you think the thing is going to be, or where do you think the first person is going to look for the hidden item? Chocolate, I suppose, in this particular case. So that's the false belief task. And the general assumption in the literature was that children can pass that test at about 4 or 5 years of age. I think it's an extremely language-dependent test, which is the one thing I hate about the test. It's extremely linguistic. And so if children have trouble with stories, they will not do very well on this test. And then finally, at some point, people developed this test for children with an eye-tracking device. And so they, instead of asking where will the first actor look, they measure where they look for that when the first actor comes in. So that with eye tracking. And all of a sudden, it turns out that children of 2 can pass this test if you look at the eye tracking data. So all of a sudden, the age has dropped for this, and it opened the door for an eye tracking study that was done between teams of Leipzig and Japan on the 3 great ape species that they worked with. I think they did bonobos, chimpanzees, and orangutans. And you will see how that goes. So that was recently published in Science, a very nice paper. Here we go. It's a very strange test, very unusual, and this is a human to ape test to some degree.
This is basically a soap opera for great apes. Silly as it seems, researchers made videos like this to show that non-human apes can recognize that others may have false beliefs. It's part of research investigating theory of mind, which asks questions like, What do great apes like chimps, bonobos, and orangutans think about others' minds? Humans do this all the time. We think about what others are thinking, their goals, intentions, expectations, and beliefs, even false ones. But it was thought only people could understand if someone else had the wrong idea about something. This experiment was set up to test if other primates could do this. The subjects watch the drama play out, and their eye movements are tracked to see what they expect the players to do. They sip juice from a fixed straw, which holds them still enough that their gaze can be tracked. The dramatic conflict in the soap opera keeps the primates interested. They need to be invested enough to closely watch the scene. Adding an ape-like creature reminiscent of King Kong and some social conflict was just enough to keep their attention. Here's what happens in an ape soap opera, step by step. First, the human shows interest in a rock. Note the chimp observer in the upper left-hand corner of the screen. Its eyes are being tracked through this entire process. Then the mysterious primate comes in and takes the rock, making a lot of noise as it does so. The red dots show the chimp is watching the scene intently. The human and the chimp both watch the mystery primate hide the rock under the left box. Then, the human suddenly leaves. While the human is gone, the chimp watches the rock being moved. The red dots show all these motions are being tracked until finally the rock is removed altogether. The chimp sees the person coming back into the room and reaching for the boxes. Where does the chimp think the person is going to look for the rock? According to its gaze, the chimp looks on the left, even though it knows the rock is gone. In a series of these trials, all three species of apes tested, orangutans, chimps, and bonobos, looked where they thought the human would go, suggesting that these apes recognized a false belief in another mind. According to this research, non-human apes appear to understand that individuals have unique perceptions about the world. The person doesn't know the rock is gone, so the ape looks where they think the person thinks it is. This finding suggests that these apes too have some understanding of what's happening in another individual's mind.
So we've come sort of full circle now, is that theory of mind started with the ape studies, and now we have the false belief task, finally a non-linguistic false belief task that they have passed, even though there's still debate, of course, about how well they have passed. But I think we're sort of full circle, and I would say theory of mind is really not limited to humans. And for the debate on deception, this is very important, because the more complex forms of deception have, as Philippe said at the beginning, intentionality and imagination, which means that you intentionally deceive and you understand what the consequences are for the other and how the other looks at the situation. And I think apes have that capacity. And that's why when you collect anecdotes on ape deception, as Whiten and Byrne did, why you end up with a massive amount for the apes and actually very limited on the monkeys. And I want to end with one anecdote that has been filmed, because most of the anecdotes that we have are not filmed. And because it's very hard, it always happens at an unexpected moment, and you're not ready for it, and you're surprised by it, and so on. So this is a case that was filmed by Matsuzawa in the field, where a female approaches her son and wants his rocks because he's cracking nuts with the stones, which is one of these cultural traditions in Bosu, and he has good stones, and she wants his stones, and she has a trick to get them. The facial expression on her is priceless because this is the laughing face of a chimpanzee. So she's very happy. There's no problem. Yeah, I'll stop. I'll stop here. I believe it's ending here. Yeah, right.
I'm just wondering whether how well humans can intuitively read facial expressions in chimps.
They're basically similar.
That's what I'm guessing,
Yeah.
right? So our intuitions often are right about what they're doing.
Yeah. Yeah, the play face of it's called the play face officially, but it's basically laughing. If you tickle a chimpanzee, you get that face, and they make sounds also, like sounds. So it is very homologous with laughter.
Is there any correlation between the evolutionary and phylogenetic development of theory of mind or perspective taking and mirror neurons?
Mirror neurons are probably involved, but mirror neurons are such a contentious issue at the moment. So there is a proposal by John Alman in California that spindle cells are involved. He came up with that like 10 years ago, spindle cells being very long neurons that he at first had found only in humans, then he found them in humans.
Is that observational correlation or functional testing?
No, he proposed, this is not based on testing, he proposed that these spindle cells, which are limited to certain species with large brains, are involved in empathy and perspective taking and that kind of thing. Mirror neurons are very often mentioned in the context of empathy, but it's very difficult to go directly from mirror neurons.
Thank you.
Regarding mirror neurons, when you showed this chain feeding or feeding the virus, typically when you do that, you open your mouth, you mimic
when people feed the baby.
I don't see any sign of that.
No.
So, Frans, thank you very much.
Can you give a brief statement about comparison of altruistic behavior in monkeys and apes, especially now that you've shown that apes are much more deceptive than monkeys?
Yeah.
Can they utilize altruism competitively or falsely so as to gain future cooperation, sort of false altruism?
Absolutely.
And they do that more frequently than monkeys, or do monkeys not even have altruism?
All the mammals have some form of altruism, because all the mammals have some form of empathy. So the chimpanzees, they use favors to get favors back. That's very common. So for example, when a male chimpanzee tries to become the dominant male and is campaigning, which takes him a couple of months to do that, to dethrone the alpha male, they become usually very generous. They share food very easily with everyone. And there was a male in the Mahal Mountains who stayed in power for 12 years because, according to the Japanese scientists who studied him, he had a whole bribery system. He would appropriate the meat of successful hunters. He would not necessarily eat it himself, but he would give it out to those who supported him. So they said he had a whole bribery system down. I think chimpanzees have that capacity because they have a whole reciprocity system.
And does deceptive behavior decrease with increasing kinship?
You would think so. I don't know.
They don't. Thank you very much.
I was very intrigued by your comment earlier about the ownership of the dominant chimp and the subordinate chimp. Once the subordinate chimp has a hand of the banana, somehow with this ownership, the dominant will now come and snatch it away. So because there's very little developmental literature about this, but we know very young kids have to know very well about ownership. So can you comment on the chimps and the other?
Yeah, people have even done experiments on that. Is that, for example, Hans Kummer, in one of his early experiments, he would bring two baboon males into a cage and see who is dominant over the other one, over food or something like that. Let's say this one is dominant. Then he would give the subordinate the female. The subordinate would groom the female, sit with the female, while the dominant would watch. And then he would let the dominant in. The dominant would not steal the female from him. Even though if the two of them are let into the cage with the female, the dominant will immediately claim the female. People have done these experiments on it. It's called ownership, or respect of possession. That's the term that Google used.
What's the evolutionary mechanism behind it? Why would they, since they are more powerful and they have a higher rank, why wouldn't they just snap it?
It's because once you have something, you're going to defend it. And so there's a higher risk. There's another experiment. What was it again that Sarah Brosnan is doing on the ownership thing?
First possession.
Yeah.
The first possession principle is pervasive.
Yeah.
Even in hermit crabs, you have a first possession principle.
Yeah. So in chimpanzee terms, if a female, a subordinate female has taken a banana, and the dominant wants to take it, she's going to have a big screaming fight on her hands, and that's just not worth it. Maybe something else, if it was $1 million, would be worth it, but a banana is not worth it. So it's too big of a fight that you get into over those things.
Some of the complexity and the difference between the species that you described raise the possibility of high dependency on memory as well. Are there any studies that look at the level of theory of mind as linked to memory?
And of course, many animals have excellent memories and may not have theory of mind. The birds are going to remember 10,000 locations of seeds, so they have a good memory. They don't necessarily have that. So I'm not sure what the connection is here. More questions?
So you talked about how with mere self-recognition, how children, humans develop at around 20 months. Did you find similar critical ages with great apes? Like at what age did they develop that?
I think they developed it later from all that I know. And there's recently a dolphin paper that came out on mere self-recognition where they developed it earlier than humans. So I don't know what. And in children it's also variable. It's not all at 20 months.
Last question.
Frans, if chimps view humans as magically omniscient, doesn't that complicate the false belief test? If the chimp looks at where that was originally hidden, maybe it's there in some mystical way that they don't understand, but they trust the human to know.
Yeah, I think that plays especially when you get negative findings, like Povinelli got negative finding after negative finding in these tests where the chimps have to judge humans with a bucket over their heads and stuff like that. I think the chimps have no way of relating to that. And that's why I found it interesting that in this eye tracking thing they had a King Kong character built in, sort of interesting. So I think when you get negative results, that's always going to be my first thing. Could it be because they don't relate well to the humans? But when you get positive results, like in this particular case, the question doesn't really come up.
Thank you very much.